Wilhelm Boger is 51 years old when he sits before German investigators in 1958 and describes his work with the precision of a man detailing an office procedure. He speaks of intensified interrogations. He explains that his superior, Grabner, made extensive use of that authorization, which had come from Berlin bearing the signature of the Reichsführer SS. A directive that had not originated at Auschwitz but at the highest levels of the SS, intended for application throughout the concentration camp system, and which had turned torture into a regulated procedure with its own technical name before Boger or Grabner ever laid hands on a single prisoner. He explains that staff were scarce and poorly trained, and that in certain cases harsher methods were therefore necessary. He describes blows with an oxhide whip across the buttocks. He describes a man with his arms tied behind his back, suspended from a hook in the ceiling. He says that he himself took part. He says that in every case he obtained the result he wanted in a short time. He says, in the same voice with which he has said everything else, that no detainee ever suffered physical injury under his supervision because the humanly tolerable limit was never exceeded. He never raises his voice. He never pauses to search for a word. He answers every question with the fluency of someone who has mentally rehearsed the same explanation for years, waiting for the day when he would finally have to speak it aloud before someone with the authority to write it down. The room where this happened was inside Block 11 of Auschwitz I, a red brick building separated from the rest of the camp by its own wall, with the ground floor windows bricked up halfway and access restricted to anyone without authorization from the political department. It was not a prisoner barrack like the others. It was the headquarters of the camp's internal police, and from 1940 until the end, everything that occurred within its walls followed a specific chain of command, with named individuals, signatures at the bottom of documents, and a procedure its administrators called justice. From outside, the building did not look very different from the other brick blocks arranged in identical rows. No sign announced what happened behind closed doors, and that absence of any visible warning was, for those who ran the camp, part of the normal functioning of things. Inside, according to those later forced to work there, the air smelled of basement damp even on the ground floor, and the building's thick walls muffled much of the sound escaping outside, though not all of it. Prisoners in neighboring blocks learned to recognize, without anyone needing to explain it, what certain screams meant when they came faintly from that direction at particular hours of the afternoon. Before Auschwitz, Grabner had been a forest ranger, then a soldier in the Austrian army for 3 years, and from 1930 onward, a police officer in Vienna, where he rose rapidly to the rank of detective. He joined the Nazi Party in 1932, when it was still illegal in Austria, and entered the SS only a few months after Germany annexed his country in 1938. From there, he moved into the Gestapo, and from November 1939 worked for half a year as a criminal secretary in the secret police of Katowice, in occupied Poland. That became his direct springboard to Auschwitz. He arrived in May 1940, only a few weeks after the camp was created, coming from that same Katowice office. He was 34 years old, had police training, and held the position of head of the political department. His post made him responsible for internal discipline, escapes, clandestine resistance, and every unauthorized contact between prisoners and the outside world. Inside the camp, he answered only to the commandant. Outside it, he remained a Gestapo employee, which meant his authority did not end at the barbed wire. Under his command, Block 11 ceased to be merely a place of punishment and became the operational center of an apparatus of surveillance, denunciation, and interrogation that decided, every day, who remained alive. Grabner did not work alone. He had a deputy, an officer named Wojcicki, and a growing number of subordinates as the camp expanded and the underground resistance organized itself more carefully. Every mass arrival of transports multiplied the volume of case files. More people to watch, more rumors to verify, more suspicions of contact with the outside world to investigate before they became, according to the department's logic, real escapes or concrete acts of sabotage. By 1943 and 1944, it was no longer a small office inside a labor camp. It was a permanent structure, with shifts, its own archive, and an entire building reserved for its harshest functions. The large deportations of those years, including that of the Hungarian Jews in 1944, multiplied the number of suspects the department had to process. not because the newly arrived automatically represented a risk of escape or sabotage, but because the administrative chaos of every mass transport created, in itself, more opportunities for denunciation, confusion, and suspicion than at any previous stage in the camp's history. Grabner and Boger represented two different faces of the same machinery. Grabner signed, classified, decided from behind a desk who went before the Standesgericht and who first deserved an interrogation session. His power was the power of the signature and the stamp, of knowing in which file to write a word that meant someone's death, without having to be present when that death occurred. Boger, by contrast, was always in the room. His power was physical, his own body holding the rod, the detainees hanging from the bar. One administered the system from the comfortable distance of paper. The other needed to touch, strike, hear the exact sound a man made when he lost control of his own voice. Both, until the end, regarded themselves as nothing more than officials carrying out necessary work. The reach of the political department did not stop at the boundaries of the main camp. As the network of Auschwitz subcamps expanded around factories and farms in the region, any suspicion arising in those peripheral detachments, an escape attempt in a mine, unauthorized contact at an industrial site sooner or later, ended up referred to the same brick building in the parent camp, because only there did the structure, personnel, and authorization exist to process such cases. A prisoner could spend months working at a subcamp dozens of kilometers away, and still end up back in Block 11 because of an accusation he did not even know existed. The building contained 28 cells on the ground floor, most occupied by police prisoners. Polish civilians from the Katowice district, waiting for summary proceedings that almost never took place in any recognizable sense of a trial. In the basement was the bunker. Dark cells, sealed and without ventilation, where time dissolved in the absence of light, and where those who survived prolonged confinement later described the difficulty of knowing whether 3 days or 10 had passed, because the body, with no reference to external brightness or darkness, lost its own sense of time. Those same cells also served as an involuntary waiting room for those awaiting their turn before the Standesgericht, so that the disorientation of confinement was often compounded by total ignorance of when or whether the moment would come to hear a sentence. The standing cells, barely 1 square meter, with a single opening 5 centimeters by 5 through which to breathe, where as many as 4 men spent the entire night on their feet, pressed against one another because there was physically no room for any other position, and from there went directly to morning roll call to perform the day's forced labor as though the night had never happened. Such a sentence could last 20 consecutive nights, feet swollen from lack of circulation, legs that failed to function normally even after the sentence ended, and in the longest cases, the first signs of gangrene that turned the return to forced labor into a separate sentence, unwritten but no less final, and the starvation cells, where the condemned were locked without food or water until the body simply shut down. In the courtyard of the block, and sometimes in the attic, the pole punishment was also carried out. The hands tied behind the back with a chain attached to a hook, the body hoisted until the feet no longer touched the ground. The entire weight fell on the shoulders, tendons tore within minutes. The reasons that led to this chain could be as minor as picking up someone else's cigarette butt from the ground, or stopping for a single second to help a companion who had just been beaten. Those left with useless arms after such a session knew they were no longer fit for compulsory labor, and knowing that inside the camp meant knowing what the next step would be. If the shoulders did not heal enough to lift, shovel, or push again, the next destination was usually the gas chamber. For flogging, a wooden bench known among prisoners as the goat was used. Legs locked inside a box that prevented movement, torso stretched across the surface, arms extended forward. Before every session, the regulations required examination by a camp doctor, not to decide whether the punishment should be imposed, but to certify that the condemned body could withstand it without dying on the spot, so that within those walls medicine did not serve to heal, but to calibrate the exact point to which damage could be inflicted. The regulations established a maximum of 25 blows delivered with a whip or thick stick by an SS man or a prisoner in a position of authority. The condemned had to count every blow aloud in German. If he made a mistake, the count started again from the beginning. One survivor who went through that bench together with 4 other men, a Russian accused of shirking work, a German caught stealing a parcel from another prisoner. 2 Poles held in Block 11 later described the order of the session. The first Pole received his 25 blows and screamed despite himself. The second did the same. The Russian also screamed and therefore received 3 additional blows. The German received 20 and endured them in silence. The survivor, sentenced to 15 lashes, resolved not to scream. He later said that cold sweat covered his whole body during the session, but that he managed to remain silent until the end. To force a confession even before a case reached the political department, some guards pressed a suspect's face directly against the hot stove in the barrack and held it there until they obtained a name. None of this followed any proportional logic. Punishment records preserved by the camp itself show that the same offense leaving one's assigned workplace, for example, could cost one prisoner 5 days of hard labor, another 5 nights in a standing cell, a third 10 additional days of arrest, and a fourth a full 25 lashes. There was no scale. There was instead the absolute discretion of the person signing the report, and that discretion was itself another form of control. No one inside the camp could know with certainty what price would be paid for a minor infraction, and that uncertainty kept the entire population in a state of permanent alert. The last of these punishments, the starvation cells, was not used only against individuals. Beginning in the summer of 1941, Deputy Commandant Karl Fritsch established that after every successful escape, 10 men from the fugitives' block would be chosen at random to starve to death in the basement of Block 11. The logic was simple: turn the escape of 1 man into the death sentence of 10, so the rest of the camp would perform the work of surveillance on its own. That summer, one of the 10 chosen was the Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe, who volunteered to take the place of a stranger with a family. His story has been told many times. The administrative logic that produced it, far less often. That same basement in which this collective sentence was carried out served, only weeks before Kolbe's death, for another decision taken within the same chain of command. In September 1941, Fritsch proposed testing an insecticide already available in the camp's storeroom, until then used to fumigate barracks against lice, as a method of mass killing. With Commandant Rudolf Höss's approval, 900 Soviet prisoners of war and several hundred Polish prisoners already hospitalized because of illness were locked inside the sealed basement cells. Zyklon B crystals were introduced through the same ventilation openings that, in the dark cells, were normally used to deprive a single condemned person of air and light. The next day, staff opening the cells found bodies piled against the door, in the posture of people who had tried to reach the last remaining air. Höss later called the result satisfactory. That efficiency, faster and less visible to the rest of the camp than a mass shooting, was why, months later, the method was adopted as the primary procedure in the installations at Birkenau. What began as a test inside the walls of Block 11 became the central mechanism of an extermination system that would later operate on an entirely different scale. Entry into the block almost always followed the same path. Someone informed. A couple wanting to ingratiate himself with the command and secure better treatment. A prisoner bought with an extra ration of bread or the promise of avoiding transfer to a worse labor detail. A Polish civilian working inside or around the camp who reported directly to the Katowice Gestapo, with which the political department maintained constant communication. That system of small rewards, a ration, a cigarette, a guard's promise that he would remember the favor, was enough to sustain an internal surveillance network that required no explicit coercion, because hunger and fear already did that work on their own. A name reached the political department, a file was opened, and a pair of SS men went to collect the suspect from his barrack or workplace, almost always during morning or evening roll call, when the entire formation could see who was being removed from the line. That visibility was part of the method. No one disappeared silently into Block 11. The rest of the camp had to see it. Once inside, admission meant undressing, surrendering whatever personal belongings remained, and waiting in one of the ground floor cells until the political department decided whether the case merited immediate interrogation or could wait its turn. Anyone who emerged alive from an interrogation session did not automatically return to his original barrack. With shoulders dislocated by the pole or a body marked by the swing, many were sent directly to the penal company, where the chance of surviving more than a few weeks was minimal. Others, if the file ended without sustainable formal charges, returned to their block marked, watched, and knowing that a second visit to the political department rarely ended with a third opportunity. Those who entered Block 11 rarely did so for a single reason. Helping a prisoner escape or simply failing to report knowledge of an escape plan was enough. Suspicion of sabotage in camp workshops was enough. Passing a message to a civilian through the barbed wire was enough. Belonging, or appearing to belong, to one of the clandestine networks operating inside the main camp, almost always linked to the Polish Home Army, which from the earliest months of the camp's existence maintained an underground organization dedicated to gathering evidence of what happened inside, and somehow getting it to London was enough. Theft of food, possession of a cigarette, an unauthorized letter were also enough, though the fate of those caught for such lesser offenses usually differed from that of those suspected of espionage or armed resistance. A parallel economy circulated inside the camp, made up of cigarettes, bread rations, and valuables taken from deportees before they died. A market that allowed those participating in it to survive somewhat better, but which, if detected by the political department, automatically became grounds for interrogation. Not because of the value of the exchanged object, but because any uncontrolled network of exchange represented, in Grabner's eyes, an embryonic form of organization that might one day become something else. The political department classified each case, opened a file, and decided what degree of intensification the interrogation required before sending the case to the standing court, the Standesgericht, which met inside the block itself. For offenses not considered worthy of immediate execution, there was an intermediate destination, the penal company, the Strafkompanie. Created in August 1940 with a first group consisting mainly of Polish Catholic priests, persecuted from the beginning of the occupation as part of the country's intelligentsia and moral leadership, and Jewish prisoners. Its members worked in gravel pits near the camp, pushing loaded wheelbarrows uphill while other prisoners dug with shovels at the bottom of the pit, and in other seasons they were sent to drain the marshes surrounding Birkenau or to dig drainage canals. Tasks equally exhausting, but with the added burden of spending much of the working day with their bodies immersed in freezing water. The order was always to move at a run, I am Laufschritt, and the foremen prisoners in positions of authority, often more feared than the SS themselves, beat anyone who slowed down or accidentally overturned a wheelbarrow. One foreman named Krankemann became infamous for appearing before the exhausted detail returning to eat and announcing that because they had not worked hard enough, there would be no supper that night. He then sent the cauldron back to the kitchen and ordered sport. Running, crawling through mud, repeated until total exhaustion. According to preserved camp records, Jewish prisoners assigned to the penal company in the summer of 1941 survived, on average, 15 days. Sentences to the Strafkompanie were usually fixed between 1 month and 1 year, but a significant number of case files carried a different notation, bis auf weiteres, until further notice, a phrase that in practice meant the sentence lasted as long as the prisoner's life. This destination was used, among other things, as a substitute for the death penalty when it was considered useful to extract more labor from the condemned before allowing him to die. The company's register, incompletely preserved in the museum archive, documents the passage of at least 2,470 prisoners between May 1942 and November 1944 alone, a figure that does not even include the largest groups, such as Soviet prisoners of war or Czech adolescents who passed through without leaving their own separate record. That court was not a court in any recognizable sense. There was no defense, there was no appeal. It met as often as the volume of accumulated case files required, sometimes processing dozens of names in a single afternoon, read one after another by an SS officer who rarely looked up from the paper. A doctor briefly examined each accused person, not to determine guilt but to certify that his physical condition allowed him to walk upright to the execution wall. And the sentence, almost invariably death, was carried out hours later against the black wall. The brick execution wall covered with wooden planks separating Block 11 from Block 10, built that way to absorb bullets and prevent ricochets toward neighboring buildings. The condemned were stripped naked in the washroom of the block, taken out in pairs into the courtyard, placed with their backs to the wall, and shot in the back of the head. For years, the task fell with particular frequency to non-commissioned officer Gerhard Palitsch, camp duty leader, who eventually used a small-caliber rifle for the job because it was more convenient than the standard service weapon. Between 1940 and 1944, several thousand people were shot against that wall. On the 27th of May 1942, 168 prisoners, most of them Poles accused of helping escapes, were shot there in a single day, one of the highest recorded totals for one session of the Standesgericht. Block personnel kept a written record of every execution: date, prisoner number, reason. Part of those records, together with the political department's admission cards, survived the destruction of files attempted by the camp administration before the evacuation of January 1945, and today remain scattered between the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum and the Arolsen archives in Germany, where researchers have been able, decade after decade, to reconstruct the names of thousands of people whom the system itself had tried to erase twice, first by killing them, then by burning the paper proving they had existed. The bureaucracy never stopped, not even in front of the wall. In December 1942, a man arrived in that machinery who would take it to another level. Wilhelm Boger, a criminal police non-commissioned officer transferred from the Eastern Front, was assigned to the political department under Grabner's direct command. Prisoners who passed through his hands began calling him the Tiger. Boger did not invent torture at Auschwitz, but he perfected his instrument. He designed a horizontal metal bar mounted on a wooden trestle, from which a detainee was suspended with his wrists tied beneath his bent knees. Hanging upside down, with his head dangling and the most sensitive parts of the body exposed, the detainee was ordered to strip completely before being tied onto the bar, so that no clothing would cushion the blows or protect the areas most frequently targeted. One strike was enough to make him spin. As he turned, head hanging toward the floor and the entire weight of the body supported only by the bound wrists, Boger or his subordinates struck with rods, rubber hoses, or whatever they had at hand, and the swinging motion of the body itself caused each blow to land on a different point, unpredictable even to the person delivering it. Prisoners who survived the device later called it the Boger swing. Boger himself, in 1958, described it as a machine for making people talk. Boger arrived with a specific specialty: investigating escapes. He explained this himself years later to German investigators, in the same neutral tone with which he described everything else. Whenever a prisoner escaped, his job was to begin the search immediately and start interrogating the guards and prisoners from the labor detail from which the fugitive had disappeared, supported by between 2 and 4 additional SS men, depending on the scale of the case. This meant that any escape, successful or failed, automatically multiplied the number of people who ended up on the metal bar in the basement, because someone had to answer for what he knew or was suspected of knowing, even if he had taken part in nothing. That same internal surveillance function eventually led him to open a case even against a uniformed colleague, non-commissioned officer Gerhard Palitsch, the same man who executed the condemned against the Black Wall, was investigated and removed from Auschwitz for maintaining relationships with female prisoners, a case Boger later cited as proof that the department made no distinctions. The distinction, however, remained obvious. Palitsch was transferred. Prisoners denounced for comparable or lesser offenses had the bar waiting for them in the basement. A serious accusation was not necessary to end up on that bar. Rudolf Mildner, who later headed the political department, was seen on more than one occasion personally interrogating a child accused of stealing a little margarine. The witness to that scene was Perry Brod, a translator and stenographer in the department itself, born in Rio de Janeiro, raised in Berlin, an SS volunteer who specifically requested transfer to the political department shortly after arriving at the camp in April 1942, who after the war wrote a detailed report on the internal functioning of the block, a document that, despite all its limitations, remains one of the most precise descriptions of that machinery written by someone who worked inside it. Brod explained that those interrogated were examined by doctors before execution, that everything was documented, and that the procedure, although brutal, followed a protocol its administrators regarded as rigorous. Writing that report, voluntarily handed over to the British in 1945, ended up protecting its author in a way no prisoner of Block 11 could ever have imagined for himself. Brod supervised selections on the Birkenau ramp and participated in interrogations and torture within the same department where Boger worked. At the Frankfurt trial, the usefulness of his testimony in convicting other defendants outweighed his own responsibility. He received a sentence of only 4 years, a minimal fraction compared with Boger's life imprisonment, or the noose that awaited Grabner in Poland. He lived the rest of his life in West Germany, working first at a sawmill and later for an electrical equipment company, without his name ever appearing again in a criminal case. Dunja Wasserstrom, a surviving translator who was also forced to work inside the political department, left in her memoirs, published after the war under the title Never Again, a different testimony without the bureaucratic filter of someone who later needed to justify himself before a court. She described Boger during a selection on the ramp, snatching an apple from the hand of a 4- or 5-year-old child who had just stepped down from a freight car, grabbing the child by the feet and smashing him against the wall of a barrack until he died, then walking away eating the fruit while the truck carrying the other children continued toward the gas chambers. There was no file for that death. There was no Standesgericht. Boger needed neither to act. The authority he held inside Block 11 extended, in practice, to any point in the camp where he chose to exercise it. Wasserstrom and the other forced translators of the political department lived with a daily contradiction that no file recorded. They spent mornings transcribing interrogation records, and in the afternoon might cross paths in the same corridor with the man who had signed the torture order for someone they knew. They had no way to refuse the work, and no way to protect those who passed by their desks on the way to the room next door. The only thing left to them, as they later said, was to memorize what they saw in the hope that one day it might serve some purpose other than surviving one more day. Wasserstrom survived the war, emigrated, and spent much of the rest of her life insisting that this work of memory bear fruit. Her testimony was eventually incorporated into the documentation used against former members of the political department, the same office that had forced her, day after day, to transcribe the words of her own persecutors. That unchecked power eventually became a problem, though not for the reasons one might expect. Konrad Morgan, an SS judge, had come to Auschwitz following a trail of gold, jewelry, and foreign currency disappearing from the property confiscated from deportees before reaching the Reichskoffers. Personal enrichment by camp officers was, for the leadership in Berlin, a far more tangible crime than the death of prisoners, and therefore merited a formal investigation where torture and murder never had. That corruption investigation led Morgan to the door of the political department and, with it, to Grabner. In 1943, he opened a formal case. The accusation was not that prisoners had to be protected. It was that Grabner had ordered the execution of at least 2,000 people on his own initiative, without even passing through the Standesgericht that he himself presided over, meaning without complying with the sole procedure within that machinery that served to leave a record showing the death had been authorized by someone higher in the chain of command. Grabner was removed from his post in October 1943 and brought before an SS court in Weimar in October 1944. The prosecution requested 12 years in prison for murder and theft. The proceedings were suspended before a verdict could be issued. The reason was as revealing as the trial itself. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo in Berlin, refused to continue cooperating with Morgan, and without that cooperation the investigation could not proceed. The system that had created Grabner ended up protecting him from its own courts. Grabner returned to an administrative post in Katowice and later in Breslau, never having answered within the apparatus that employed him for what he had done in Block 11. The war would end before that account could be settled from within. The answer came after the war, and from somewhere else. In January 1945, with the Red Army only a few kilometers from Auschwitz, Boger fled west with the rest of the camp administration. Grabner, by contrast, hid in the Austrian countryside, working under a false identity as a farm laborer for a farmer in Lower Austria. Someone informed on him. He was personally arrested while working in the fields by a lawyer named Heinrich Dürrmayer, who led a special unit of the Vienna police dedicated to hunting war criminals. Dürrmayer himself had been a prisoner in several concentration camps, among them Auschwitz, and would later become head of the Austrian state police. The man who had signed death sentences inside Block 11 was arrested by someone who had survived a system like the one he had administered. Grabner spent 2 years in custody before Poland secured his extradition in July 1947. In November of that year, the first Auschwitz trial opened in Krakow before Poland's Supreme National Tribunal, with 40 former members of the camp staff in the dock. The first attempt by a state directly devastated by occupation to try, under its own laws and before its own judges, those who had run the camp that had killed an enormous part of its population. Of the 40 defendants, 23 were sentenced to death and 6 to life imprisonment. Grabner was among the former, sentenced on the 22nd of December 1947. He was hanged in Montelupich prison on the 28th of January 1948 at 7:09 the morning, in a group of 21 executions carried out that day in batches of 5 and 6. Among those executed with him were former head overseer of the women's camp, Maria Mandel, and former commandant Arthur Liebehenschel, the same man who had succeeded Rudolf Höss as head of the camp. The bodies of those executed were afterward delivered to the medical faculty of the University of Krakow for student dissection practice. Boger took longer to pay. Arrested by American troops at the end of the war, he was extradited toward Poland but managed to escape custody during the transfer and take refuge again in Germany. For more than a decade he lived under a false name, working ordinary jobs, while no one around him knew what he had done inside Block 11. Only in 1958 did the authorities of West Germany finally catch up with him, by which point, for the first time since the end of the war, they had begun to take seriously the systematic prosecution of former camp personnel. That arrest produced the interrogation with which this story begins, the calm and meticulous description of a man still convinced he had crossed no boundary. That trial would not have existed without the insistence of one man. Fritz Bauer, Attorney General of the state of Hesse and himself a Jew exiled during Nazism, had spent years pushing against the resistance of much of West Germany's own judicial apparatus, which was reluctant to disturb a past many of its officials had shared in one form or another. Bauer insisted that Auschwitz not be judged in the abstract as a state policy without individual perpetrators, but through the names, positions, and individual acts of those who had operated its mechanisms. Boger and Block 11 became, because of that insistence, central pieces of the case. 5 years later, in December 1963, the trial that would finally dismantle that version began in Frankfurt. The prosecution of 22 former members of the Auschwitz staff, the most extensive and detailed proceeding ever conducted against the camp inside Germany, and the first in which a post-war German court had to establish, case by case, what degree of individual responsibility remained behind the formula. I was only following orders. Boger was one of the central defendants. Sitting beside him, among others, was Rapportführer Oswald Kaduk, who would also receive a life sentence. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 3 to 14 years, an enormous distance from the scale of what was being judged, and one of the reasons why this first major German trial, despite its historical importance, left much of society with the sense that justice had arrived late and incompletely. The German press covered the proceedings day by day for almost 2 years, and the term Auschwitz trial entered the public vocabulary of a generation that until then had preferred not to ask too much about what its parents, neighbors, or former superiors had done during the war. For many Germans born after 1945, it was the first time they heard, with concrete names attached, how a place they knew only by name had actually functioned from within. There had been, in 1943, a formal attempt to end the method. When Arthur Liebehenschel replaced Höss as commandant, he officially prohibited use of the swing. The order was recorded in the camp's administrative archives, and for years historians cited that date as the end of the apparatus. Testimonies later gathered in the Auschwitz trials contradicted that version. Boger continued using the swing with the same regularity, with or without formal authorization, because inside Block 11 the written order of a commandant carried less weight than the custom established by the man who actually ran the room. During the Frankfurt hearings, a survivor, named Paul Leo Seidel, stood before the court with an exact replica of the device he had suffered in Block 11. He displayed it and explained how it worked, how the wrists were tied, how the body spun, where the blows landed. The courtroom, according to those present, fell completely silent as the object, a metal bar on a wooden trestle, the same apparatus Boger had called a machine for making people talk, turned once more, this time empty, before the judges. Boger denied killing anyone. He could not deny the device existed. On the 19th of August 1965, he was convicted of at least 144 murders, joint participation in 10 more, and complicity in the deaths of more than 1,000 people. The sentence was life imprisonment plus 15 years of hard labor. Boger died in prison in Bietigheim-Bissingen on the 3rd of April 1977, without having served even a fraction of that sentence outside prison. The building still stands within the camp grounds, with the basement closed to the public and the black wall reconstructed on the exact spot where the original once stood. The same wooden planks fixed over the brick to continue absorbing, decades later, bullets that are no longer fired. The metal bar Seidel held that day in Frankfurt no longer turns. It remains, like the file of every execution, like Broad's report, like Boger's recorded confession from 1958, as one of the few surviving pieces of a system that meticulously documented its own cruelty, convinced until the end that it was acting within the law. The Standesgericht notebooks, the admission cards, the penal company register, all that paper that survived the attempt to burn it in January 1945, remains catalogued, scanned, available today to anyone who wants to consult it, an entire archive constructed, paradoxically, by the same bureaucratic obsession that made every one of the deaths it records possible. Anyone who walks today through the ground floor corridor of Block 11 can stop before the same metal door that separated the punishment cells from the office where Grabner signed his case files, only a few meters apart, as though the distance between bureaucracy and the basement had never been. Inside that building, more than a short corridor, the same one crossed every day by those who entered on their feet and left, if they left at all, dragging them toward the courtyard and the wall.